Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a rapidly escalating situation in the Middle East that the mainstream press is packaging in neat little segments but refusing to connect. We have 5 major stories tonight, and when you lay them side by side, a very disturbing picture emerges. A picture of a widening war, economic opportunism, military escalation, and civilian slaughter that is being normalized in real time. Maya, let's get right into it.
Absolutely, Alex. Let's start with the story that should have everyone's alarm bells ringing. Israeli attacks have killed at least 41 people in the Lebanese town of Nabi Chit. That's according to Middle East Eye's live reporting. 41 people in a single town, from combined air and ground attacks. We're not talking about a military installation. We're talking about a town, with families, with homes, with children. And the international response has been what we've come to expect, virtually non-existent.
Let's be very precise about what's happening here, because precision matters when lives are at stake. Nabi Chit is in the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon. These are not surgical strikes against military targets. When you kill 41 people in a single town through combined air and ground operations, you are conducting an assault on a civilian population center. That is not counterterrorism. That is collective punishment, and under the Geneva Conventions, it is a war crime. Period. Full stop. No amount of diplomatic language changes that fact.
And what's critical to understand is the pattern, Alex. This is not an isolated incident. This is part of a systematic escalation of Israeli military operations into Lebanon that has been accelerating for months. Each attack gets a brief headline, maybe 12 hours of coverage, and then it's memory hold. But the people of Nabi Chit don't get to forget. The families pulling bodies from rubble don't get to move on to the next news cycle. We need to ask who in the international community is providing the weapons, the diplomatic cover, and the intelligence that makes these strikes possible?
And that brings us directly to our second story tonight, which connects like a wire to a detonator. 3 U.S. Air Force B-1 Lancer bombers have just landed at Royal Air Force Fairford in Gloucestershire, England. Now, for our viewers who may not know, the B-1 Lancer is not a defensive aircraft. It is a long-range strategic bomber capable of carrying massive conventional payloads. These are not parked in Britain for a training exercise. Middle East Eye is reporting this because the implications are enormous. You don't forward deploy B-1s unless you are preparing for a significant escalation.
Let's talk about what RAF Fairford actually is, because context matters. This base has historically been used as a staging ground for U.S. bombing campaigns. It was used during the Kosovo War, it was used during the Iraq invasion in 2003, and it was used for operations in Afghanistan. When B-1 Lancers show up at Fairford, military analysts understand exactly what that signals. This is pre-positioning of strategic strike assets within range of the Middle East and Iran specifically. The question every journalist should be asking is, what has been communicated behind closed doors that we are not being told?
And notice the timing, Maya. You have Israeli forces killing dozens of civilians in Lebanon. You have strategic bombers being deployed to Britain. And simultaneously, this is our third story, Iranian authorities are warning their own population against a so-called fifth column. Iran's intelligence ministry, according to Al Jazeera, has renewed calls for citizens to report any suspicious activity through phone calls and messaging services. Now, when a government starts telling its people to report their neighbors, that is a government preparing for war. They are tightening internal security because they believe an external threat is imminent.
This is a textbook wartime posture, Alex. The fifth column rhetoric is historically one of the most dangerous tools a government can deploy against its own people. It creates an atmosphere of suspicion, it justifies surveillance, it provides cover for cracking down on dissidents and political opponents under the guise of national security. But here's what I want our viewers to understand, Iran is not doing this in a vacuum. They are watching the same B-1 bombers land in Britain. They are watching the same bombs fall on Lebanon. They are reading the strategic signals, and they are preparing their population for what they believe is coming.
And this is where the mainstream media completely fails the public. CNN will cover the Iranian crackdown as evidence of authoritarian overreach. Fox will cover the B-1 deployment as a show of American strength. The BBC will cover the Lebanon strikes with careful, both sides framing. But nobody, is connecting these 3 stories and saying the obvious. We are watching a regional war expand in real time, with multiple nuclear-armed or nuclear-capable states moving pieces into position. This is not a series of unrelated events. This is escalation with a capital E.
Which brings us to the diplomatic front, and our fourth story. Turkish President Erdogan has spoken with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and according to Middle East Eye's reporting, Erdogan told Starmer that more can be done for a diplomatic solution. Now on the surface, that sounds encouraging. Diplomacy, dialogue, peaceful resolution. But let's read between the lines. When Erdogan says more can be done, he is implicitly saying that what is currently being done is not enough. He is acknowledging that the existing diplomatic framework has failed.
And let's talk about who these two leaders actually are in this context. Erdogan is the president of a NATO member state that shares a border with the conflict zone. Turkey has its own complicated history with both Israel and Iran, and Erdogan has been increasingly vocal in his criticism of Israeli military operations. Starmer, meanwhile, is leading a country that just allowed 3 American strategic bombers to land on its soil. So when Erdogan calls Starmer and says, "We need to do more diplomatically," there is an enormous elephant in the room. Britain is actively facilitating military escalation while claiming to support diplomacy.
This is the fundamental hypocrisy that Truth Report exists to expose. You cannot be a platform for peace while simultaneously being a launchpad for war. The British government cannot credibly claim to support diplomatic solutions while hosting B-1 Lancer bombers at RAF Fairford. These positions are mutually exclusive. And Erdogan, whatever his own complicated motivations, is essentially calling this out. He's saying to Starmer, "You have leverage here, you have the ability to constrain this escalation, and you are choosing not to use it." That is a diplomatic indictment.
Now let's pivot to the economic dimension, because wars are always, about money and power. Our fifth story comes from the South China Morning Post, and it's a fascinating window into how the global economy is reshaping itself around this conflict. Hong Kong's Financial Secretary Paul Chan Imopa has stated that Hong Kong's economic growth forecast of 2.5 to 3.5% will remain on track despite the Middle East war. But here's the key detail that most outlets buried: he said the war would hurt the trading sector but benefit the financial market.
Let me repeat that for our viewers because it deserves to sink in. The Financial Secretary of Hong Kong has openly stated that while war hurts trade, meaning real goods, real supply chains, real workers, it benefits the financial market. He is telling you, in plain language, that Wall Street and its equivalents in Hong Kong and London profit from war. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the Financial Secretary of a major global financial hub stating it as economic fact. War is good for the financial class. War is bad for everyone else. He said it. On the record.
And think about what that means in the context of everything else we've discussed tonight. 41 people are dead in Nabi Chit, Lebanon. Iranian citizens are being told to spy on their neighbors. Strategic bombers are being prepositioned in Europe. Diplomats are making phone calls that lead nowhere. And the financial class is calculating their returns. Paul Chan also said Hong Kong would remain vigilant over the impacts of Sino-US relations while consolidating traditional American and European markets and developing new ones in Asia. That is the language of repositioning, not peacemaking.
What Chan is describing is the economic architecture of a new world order being built on the rubble of the current conflict. Hong Kong, and by extension, Beijing, is watching this war and seeing opportunity. They're not trying to stop it. They're trying to position themselves to benefit from however it reshapes global trade flows. When he talks about developing new markets in Asia while maintaining European and American ones, he's describing a hedging strategy. China is betting that this war will weaken Western economic dominance, and they want to be ready to fill the vacuum.
And this is the part that should make every working person furious, regardless of where they live. The people dying in Lebanon didn't choose this war. The Iranian citizens being surveilled didn't choose this war. The families in the path of B-1 bomber payloads didn't choose this war. But the financial class, in Hong Kong, in London, in New York, they are actively profiting from it. The stock prices of defense contractors go up every time a bomb drops. The price of oil fluctuates in ways that make traders rich. War is, and has always been, a wealth transfer mechanism from the many to the few.
Let's go deeper on the Iran story, Alex, because Al Jazeera's reporting reveals something that deserves much more scrutiny. The Iranian intelligence ministry is using both traditional phone calls and modern messaging services to collect reports of suspicious activity. That means they are building a digital surveillance infrastructure on top of their existing security apparatus. This is not just paranoia, this is institutional preparation. They are creating the mechanisms to identify, track, and neutralize anyone they deem a threat, whether that threat is real or imagined.
And we need to acknowledge the legitimate security concerns alongside the authoritarian overreach. Iran is facing genuine threats. There is a documented history of covert operations, assassinations of nuclear scientists, cyber attacks like Stuxnet, and sabotage operations conducted against Iranian infrastructure. When Iranian authorities talk about a fifth column, they are not operating in a fantasy. But, and this is a crucial but, the response of surveilling your entire population and encouraging citizens to inform on each other is a cure worse than the disease. It destroys social trust. It atomizes civil society. And it makes genuine resistance to authoritarianism nearly impossible.
This is a pattern we see repeated across history and across the political spectrum. Governments facing external threats use those threats to justify internal repression. The United States did it after September 11th with the Patriot Act. Israel does it with its ongoing surveillance of Palestinian populations. And now Iran is doing it as the drums of war get louder. The tragedy is that ordinary Iranians, people who want peace, who want normalcy, who want to live their lives, are caught between external military threats and their own government's security apparatus. They have no good options.
Let me bring this back to the Erdogan-Starmer conversation, because there's a geopolitical dimension here that's being completely ignored. Turkey is a NATO member. Britain is a NATO member. The United States, whose bombers just landed in Britain, is the leader of NATO. NATO was designed as a defensive alliance. But what we are witnessing is NATO infrastructure, bases, logistics networks, communication systems, being used to project offensive power into the Middle East. Erdogan sees this. He understands that Turkey could be drawn into a wider conflict through its NATO obligations, and that terrifies him.
And this is why the Erdogan-Starmer phone call is more significant than it appears. Erdogan is not just making a diplomatic plea. He is signaling to the NATO alliance that Turkey will not be a willing participant in an escalation against Iran. He is drawing a line. Because Turkey understands something that Washington and London seem to have forgotten: geography matters. Turkey shares a border with Iran. If this war expands, Turkish cities, Turkish soldiers, Turkish civilians will be in the line of fire. London and Washington have the luxury of distance. Ankara does not.
Let's also examine the media framing of these stories, because it reveals the machinery of manufactured consent. The South China Morning Post frames Hong Kong's economic outlook as resilience, a positive story about weathering the storm. Middle East Eye frames the B-1 deployment as a factual military development without editorializing about what it means. Al Jazeera frames the Iranian fifth column warning as a domestic security story. And the Lebanon strikes are reported as casualty numbers, clinical, detached, as if 41 dead human beings are a statistic rather than a catastrophe.
This is the normalization machine at work. Each story is presented in isolation, stripped of context, drained of moral urgency. The audience is trained to consume these stories the way they consume weather reports, as information to note, not as crises to respond to. But we refuse to do that on this show. These stories are not separate. They are chapters in the same book. A book about a war that is expanding, an economy that profits from death, and a diplomatic system that has completely failed to protect civilian life.
I want to go back to the Lebanon strikes for a moment because I think we owe it to the victims to be specific. Nabi Chit is a town in the Bekaa Valley with a primarily Shia Muslim population. It has been targeted repeatedly during Israeli operations against Hezbollah. But targeting a town is not the same as targeting a military organization. The people who died in these strikes were not all fighters. They were not all combatants. Many of them were simply people who lived there, who were born there, who raised families there, who had no means or desire to leave their homes.
And under international humanitarian law, the principle of distinction requires that parties to a conflict distinguish between combatants and civilians at all times. The principle of proportionality prohibits attacks where the expected civilian harm is excessive in relation to the military advantage anticipated. Killing 41 people in a single town raises the most serious questions about whether these principles were respected. Where is the International Criminal Court? Where is the United Nations Human Rights Council? Where is the accountability mechanism that is supposed to prevent exactly this kind of mass civilian casualty event?
The accountability mechanism doesn't exist in any meaningful way, Maya, and that's by design. The permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, have veto power over any binding resolution. The United States has historically vetoed virtually every resolution critical of Israeli military operations. So the system that is supposed to protect civilians in armed conflict has been deliberately neutralized by the very powers that claim to champion human rights. This is not a failure of the system. The system is working exactly as it was designed to work, protecting the powerful from accountability.
And this brings us full circle to Paul Chan's remarkable admission in Hong Kong. The financial markets benefit from war. The defense industry benefits from war. The surveillance technology companies benefit from war. The political leaders who wrap themselves in the flag benefit from war. The people who do not benefit from war are the 41 dead in Nabi Chit. The Iranian citizens living under expanding surveillance. The Turkish families worried about being dragged into a wider conflict. The working people everywhere whose tax dollars fund the bombs and whose children fill the uniforms.
Let me also highlight something about the B-1 Lancer deployment that military analysts will understand but most viewers will not. The B-1B has been upgraded over the years to carry the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, or JSSM, which has a range of over 500 miles. From bases in Britain, with aerial refueling, these aircraft can strike targets across the entire Middle East. 3 bombers may not sound like much, but each B-1 can carry up to 24 JASSMs. That is 72 precision-guided cruise missiles pre-positioned in Europe, ready to launch. That is not deterrence. That is preparation.
And the fact that this deployment was reported openly tells us something important. The United States wants Iran and other regional actors to know these bombers are there. This is strategic signaling. It's a message that says, we have the capability and the positioning to strike, and we want you to know it. But strategic signaling is a dangerous game. Because it doesn't just deter, it also provokes. It feeds exactly the kind of siege mentality that leads Iran's intelligence ministry to warn about fifth columns and surveillance. Every escalatory action produces an escalatory reaction. That is the iron law of conflict dynamics.
And where are the voices for de-escalation? Where are the world leaders standing up and saying, enough? Erdogan is making phone calls, but phone calls don't stop bombs. The United Nations issues statements, but statements don't rebuild homes. The editorial pages express concern, but concern doesn't bring back the dead. We are in a moment that demands moral courage from leaders, and we are getting nothing but strategic calculation and economic positioning. Hong Kong is positioning its markets. Britain is positioning its airbases. Iran is positioning its security apparatus. And civilians are positioning their children under whatever shelter they can find.
I want to be very direct with our viewers tonight. What you are witnessing across these 5 stories is the architecture of a wider war being assembled in real time. The military pieces are moving, bombers to Britain, ground forces into Lebanon. The economic pieces are moving, financial markets recalibrating for prolonged conflict. The diplomatic pieces are failing, phone calls that produce statements but no action. And the domestic security pieces are tightening, surveillance expanding, civil liberties contracting, populations being conditioned to accept permanent war footing. If this trajectory continues without intervention, we are heading toward a regional conflagration that could dwarf anything we've seen since the Second World War.
And this is why independent journalism matters more than ever. The mainstream media has largely abdicated its responsibility to connect these dots. They report each story in its silo, they quote official sources without challenge, they frame military escalation as developments and civilian massacres as incidents. Truth report exists because someone has to say the things that the access-dependent press corps won't say. Someone has to name the war crimes. Someone has to follow the money. Someone has to ask who benefits and who bleeds.
So here is our call to action tonight, and we mean this with every fiber of our being. Do not accept the normalization of what is happening. Do not let 41 dead in Lebanon become background noise. Do not let strategic bombers land on Allied soil without demanding answers from your elected representatives. Do not let financial elites celebrate war profits while working families struggle under the economic consequences of conflict. Call your representatives. Demand transparency. Demand accountability. Demand that your government pursue genuine diplomacy, not diplomatic theater designed to provide cover for military escalation.
Share this report. Talk to your neighbors, your co-workers, your families. Break through the information silos that keep us fragmented and passive. Read the sources we've cited tonight, South China Morning Post, Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, and read them critically. Ask who funds them, what perspectives they center, and what they leave out. Build your own picture from multiple sources. And above all, refuse to be a passive consumer of war. Your attention, your voice, your vote, your purchasing power, these are tools. Use them.
For Truth Report, I'm Maya Clarity. The truth doesn't hide. It waits for someone brave enough to speak it. Stay informed. Stay angry. Stay human. Good night.